Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for the Garrison Institute Forum series on Pathways to Planetary Health. I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute, and it is my pleasure to host this conversation with Sebene Selassie. By the way, Sebene, we see an image of the world and not an image of you. Sebene Selassie has studied Buddhism for over 30 years. She received a BA from McGill University in Religious and Women's Studies and an MA from the New School, where she focused on cultural studies of race. For over 20 years, Sebene has worked with children, youth, and families nationally and internationally in both small and large not-for-profits. She's been teaching meditation workshops, courses, and retreats for over a decade, and is one of the most popular teachers on 10% Happier app. Her first book, You Belong, A Call for Connection, is being published by Harper One this month. Here is a copy of the book. It's fantastic. It's honest, it's direct, it's interesting. You'll learn stuff, and we're going to talk about some ideas that are in it. And I highly recommend that You Belong belongs to you by buying it. The You Belong book launch is actually happening next week with a virtual gathering on August 25th, sponsored by Greenlight Bookstore, which is one of the great independent bookstores of Brooklyn. And we'll put a link to that, to register that in the chat. And this evening, Sebene and Sharon Salzberg will be in conversation about their forthcoming books, both of them. So Sharon has a book, Real Change, and Sebene's You Belong, hosted by the New York Insight Meditation Center. And again, we'll put a link to that in the chat. And if other interesting things come up, we'll put links to that in the chat. I kind of sound like Dr. Zeus. Before we begin today's conversations, just a few logistical items. We're on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video is off. Some of you are also listening on YouTube. And we'll reserve the last 15 minutes for questions, so put your questions in the Q&A panel. We're on for an hour, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. A recording of this will be made available on the Garrison Institute website. So let's begin. Sebene. So one of the interesting things that is a pervasive theme throughout your book and throughout your work is a pervasive theme throughout Buddhism itself. And that is the recognition that the world not divides, but the world can be perceived from a relative reality aspect and an absolute reality aspect. And I think of these almost as the way in quantum mechanics, you can see something as a particle and a wave, and they're both. Neither one denies the other one. So let's talk about what relative reality means to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, Jonathan, and thank you to the Garrison Institute. It's really an honor to have this conversation with you.
Oh, great.
So what's often referred to in Buddhism as the doctrine of two truths, the absolute or ultimate truth, and then the relative or conventional truth. And one of the things to understand about these two truths is that it's a paradox, which is what makes it kind of challenging or hard, just like most of us don't understand what we really mean when we say that things are particles and waves. That it's hard to wrap our minds around the fact that the absolute truth of reality, that it's interconnected, that there's no separation, that this is all just vibrating energy, and both ancient wisdom tells us that, and modern science tells us that, and the truth that there is a relative reality of difference, and me being here in Brooklyn, you being upstate, the fact that we have these identities that are social identities as well. I'm a woman, I think you identify as a man, I'm Black, you're white. We have religious differences, perhaps. And so these relative differences can sometimes seem to contradict the fact that we're not separate and ultimately interconnected.
I almost think of the relative reality as articulated points on the node of being. That being is this vast, undifferentiated, vibrational consciousness, but it manifests in these physical ways that turn out to be us. And that us has pain and suffering. And part of your work is to try and help yourself and others relieve some suffering. So talk about the relative reality side and is we in Buddhism they say that suffering is an illusion, but it's also pretty real.
Yeah, what I notice is that we're often trying to find our balance between these two truths. And depending on the moment, depending how we're situated, who we're in relationship with, even, we can kind of lean towards one truth or the other. And in that leaning, sometimes lose perspective and not see the other truth. So for me, I can and have been throughout my life entangled in the relative truth, that I can get attached to it, and to use a Buddhist terminology, to cling to that relative truth of difference, of also what difference has led to in this culture of separation and domination and oppression, which is inequity and real suffering. As you say, that relative suffering is real. That if I get only entangled in that, I lose the truth of interconnection, and I can see myself as separate from other people, from other things, from nature itself. And we can also kind of lean heavily into the absolute truth and kind of cling to the harmony of interconnection and ignore the pain and suffering of the relative reality. And a lot of times in productive conflict, so not where people are so oppositional they can't see each other's side, although this theory or understanding can help that too. But even in conversations with people whom we love and mostly agree with, we can be sort of seeing things from two different sides. And one person is clinging to the absolute side of interconnection. The other person is lost maybe in the entanglement of difference. And we're not really hearing each other because we're not seeing the truth of that paradox.
Mm.
And a lot of suffering between people occurs because of that.
Mm. I want to go into the absolute a little bit more, because in some ways it's the nature of nature, that everything is continually interdependent and continually co-evolving, continually in a flow, with nothing having its own independent inherent existence. And when one can get into that state of mind, it's a pretty nice state of mind to be in. So talk more about that.
It is a nice state of mind to be in. And, to kind of come back to clinging, there can be a clinging to that experience that, again, has us ignore the relative truth as well. Because
Right.
sometimes, and I notice this in myself, I think the absolute is more true.
Mm-hmm.
That's an assumption that shows up in a lot of spiritual language, in a lot of spiritual communities. I would say very much so in kind of a new age reality, where there's almost a desperate wish for the absolute to be more true than the relative. And that's why I love that it's called the doctrines of two truths. They're both true, and that being able to really be in that paradox is the challenge, because there's a clinging to comfort, and sometimes the absolute does feel more comfortable, but not always, because a feeling of emptiness and dissolution isn't always comfortable, right? But there are experiences associated with the absolute, that feeling of interconnection, of non-separation, especially those feelings in nature. They're very nourishing, they're very healing, they're really important for us as experiences, and why we encourage retreat, encourage contemplative practice, encourage slowing down, resting, rejuvenating, nourishing. Those are all part of feeling that spaciousness, but they're not there so that we can avoid the difficulty and challenge of the relative reality. And to not say that the relative reality is only difficult and challenging. There's a lot of beauty in difference. There's a lot of power in differentiation and seeing the wonder of nature in its specific forms as well as its connected forms.
And this particular cultural manifestation is only one of thousands and thousands that have been and will be and can be the way we divide between the bridge between our absolute and relative truth. So there are other cultures, more indigenous ways of knowing, that have integrated them better. And you have this wonderful phrase, epistemocide. So talk about that.
Yeah, so epistemocide, it's a phrase or a word that was popularized by a Portuguese academic, Boaventura de Sousa Santos. And he used it to talk about social justice, not just from a political material level, but what he called cognitive social justice. And that with colonization, with genocide came not only the killing of peoples, but also the killing of ways of knowing. So like epistemology,
Right.
and side like genocide. So epistemocide is the killing of ways of knowing. And this phenomena is really apparent all around us in the sense that we've lost ways of knowing from indigenous cultures and indigenous communities because they were suppressed by a colonial project that emphasized scientific materialism, material reality, particular ways of knowing, and discounted these what may seem more spiritual ways of knowing, what's often called woo-woo or labeled woo-woo by modern peoples, and dismissing those because they don't hold up to kind of a scientific materialist way of understanding.
What we're learning is the scientific materialist way of understanding is limited. You said to me that Bruno Latour said that moderns are people who believe that others believe.
Yeah, I love that quote.
So, by the way, I want to quote from your book, because I think this is really a fantastic overall frame. You said there's a paradox. Although we are not one, we are not separate. And although we are not separate, we are not the same. Human survival depends upon us understanding this truth. And so it seems like the epistemology that we are currently functioning on is not doing a good job of understanding that truth. So talk about that.
Yeah, it's a very challenging truth. And that's my way. We are not one, we are not separate. We are not separate, but we are not the same is my way of articulating the doctrine of two truths. And what I find challenging about that and what I witness is that it really requires us to include all things. So all experiences, all realities, including our historical reality, and all people, even those we don't agree with and outright oppose, as part of that interconnection.
Exactly.
And so our spiritual task, our social task, our political task then becomes one of not othering anyone, which is challenging to do, especially in this political climate, in this moment when there's a lot of othering going on, and there's a tendency to want to fall into that.
Yes. So in Buddhism, there's the phrase, we want to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings. Mm. So I'm going to take this in two different directions. So number one, I was discussing that with somebody, and they said, from the way I was describing this, said, you're limiting yourself because rocks are sentient beings too. They just are slower in their sentience. So that challenges us to really expand all sentient beings to include the microbes and the soil and all the things that, by the way, our Western civilization is causing enormous suffering too, but to really see this magnificent whole. But the second thing is when we say we want to relieve the sufferings of all sentient beings, that includes people, by the way, we're not going to get political in this conversation, but it includes people like Donald Trump, and who, in my senses, is suffering enormously and is causing enormous suffering. And if he truly was relieved of suffering, and if he truly dwelt in equanimity and well-being, then the world would be so much better off. Um, but I've had people say to me, "Oh, but you can't wish him well-being." I think all sentient beings means all sentient beings. So talk about that.
Yeah, I always like to add to that that wish of all sentient beings without exception.
Right.
So there are no loopholes. And I really appreciate you bringing up rocks. I talk about in the book an experience when I was in South Africa and with a group, and someone was explaining to us the concept of Ubuntu, and this concept that's well known, has been popularized by Desmond Tutu and others, that I am because you are, that there is this interconnection between all people, is what he said. And then he realized he was talking to a bunch of Americans, and he said, oh, and everything is people. Water is people, mountains are people, animals are people, air is people. And he said rocks are people. And that really struck me. I in that moment, I understood the profundity of indigenous wisdom that recognizes that absolute truth in this really, really deep and profound way. So yes, all things are people, all the elements, and that acknowledges that also, again, scientific truth, that there is an interconnection between all of reality, that all of what we witness and experience with our ordinary senses came from an infinitesimally small, unfathomably small dot. And all of this emerged from that. So there's no way it can't be interconnected. It came from basically nothing and became us, right? So to marry that with this wish for all beings without exception to be free, and to be free means to be really connected to the truth of wisdom and compassion, of love and kindness, and ultimately joy, then means that we wish it for people we don't like, people we don't know, and even people who we ostensibly despise. And for some of us, actually, that might be easier. There are some people who have a really hard time with wishing it for a particular political figure or someone who they disagree with. But it also means acknowledging those who we don't even normally see or notice. It means wishing, having that ability to have the consciousness of really recognizing the sacredness of all beings. And for me, that has been a really interesting exploration of what's normally called implicit bias or unconscious bias, and the parts of ourselves we don't even see. We might be very aware of our disgust towards this person or that person and working with it, even if we're having a challenging time working with those feelings. But what about all the things we're not aware of? Sometimes we use that image of an iceberg and only the tip is above the water, and there's this huge mass of ice under the water. And we spend a lot of time in our meditation practice, in the modern meditation practice, kind of working with the psychological unconscious material, maybe the personal trauma or wounding, but there's also a lot of cultural unconscious material under the water as well. And so I'm also really interested in all beings also means the beings that we have unconscious biases towards, either through ignoring or through harming unconsciously. And I always say the most important part of that phrase, unconscious bias, is the unconscious part.
Right.
We don't even notice it or know it.
Right. It's just something that came to mind early in my Buddhist study practice. I was on a summer retreat with Gelek Rinpoche, who was my main teacher. And it was at a funky retreat center in Michigan. And all of a sudden, and flies were coming in. And he had a jar, and he started catching the flies and then carefully releasing them outside. And I had previously not taken such care with flies. Ever since I do. But you begin to realize that's an unconscious bias. You begin to realize that how we other fly, we other all kinds of things. And when I was growing up, we heard about the deeply religious Indians who were so careful not even to step on ants, and we kind of trivialized that when I was a kid. But in fact, so I want to take this to another place. Many people I know today feel a general unease. After the murder of George Floyd, the exposure of racism and the knowledge that we can demonstrate there's so much we can do, but it's not done and it won't be done for a while. And we have seen economic disproportionate distribution of opportunity, poor distribution of opportunity. We've seen vast displaced refugees, and there is so much we see in the world. And what's interesting is the more you realize that you're a we, in addition to being a me, the more those are part of your feelings. And so you're always kind of not just bearing witness to it, but bearing the actual feeling of all that. So how do we hold all that? And how can we find happiness when we're bearing the burdens of the unhappiness that we see, the suffering that we see?
Yeah, really easy question, Jonathan.
Sorry. Well, I'm going to a master. I got a question and you're here, so I need help.
There's the structural realities and challenges, which I'm not an expert in, that will require action and different levels of involvement and engagement based on our interests and capabilities and energies and resources, all of those things. And then there's the inner work, which is what I'm interested in. And I really, I'm really intrigued by, or let's say, I question whether we can do that structural work without that inner work, because so much of it is unconscious. And I really saw this in myself. I was raised in white neighborhoods. I went to white schools. I immigrated to the States when I was 3 with my family and from Ethiopia. And I sort of just absorbed the anti-Black racism of this country and of this reality because that's what I was surrounded by. And I didn't really have a conscious education around that until my late teens and early 20s. And I really had to seek that out myself. And it was maybe easier for me to seek it out because I was having this double consciousness experience, experiencing racial aggression and certain hateful experiences from the kids in my neighborhood or people around me or the culture in general. So I was trying to make sense of it. And one of the things I had to really contend with is kind of the guilt of having absorbed all of that. And so this reckoning that we have to do that our unconscious conditioning is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And it's only from there that we can actually make these conscious changes in the culture. So if we're only sort of looking outside at structural issues, we continue to perpetuate the same problems because we're not really discovering what's underneath the iceberg. So it's like someone who becomes a therapist but hasn't dealt with their own rage,
Right.
And so it's kind of identifying these problems out there, but not even aware of what's kind of boiling under the surface in their own being. So if we're not contending with all the ways that we hold these really harmful values of the society that we swim in inside of us, we can't change those things outside. So for me, it was a whole process of kind of re-educating and uneducating myself from these societal cultural values. And that's a huge overhaul, which you see many people, white people in particular, contending with now in terms of reading more things by Black folks, by people of color, trying to understand the racial reality of the country. So that's a reckoning that has to happen both internally and externally. And I think that's where meditation, mindfulness, contemplative practices can really play a part, so that people can start to see what's under the surface. We're not going to see it just through conscious work, because it is unconscious material.
Right. I love that phrase. Our unconscious conditioning is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And I would also say that the culture that we have is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And since we are interdependent, and we do have, I think we have free will, then we can choose to radiate a difference in at least our little, there's this huge fabric, right? My vibrations may not be able to solve Siberia, but maybe it can at least solves too wrong a word, but it can have a more positive influence, at least on the little eddies that are around me. And if we all do that, it adds up to a larger cultural transformation.
Yes. And, each of us has to kind of strike that balance of understanding what change is possible from within. So paying attention and starting to really understand ourselves, see clearly our minds, our hearts, our somatic reality. And then also then how that can impact, like you're saying, starting from the local and outwards. And just like with meditation practice, it's simple, but it's not easy, and it takes a certain amount of effort and dedication. Our work inside and our work outside requires that attention, that energy, that effort, balanced with all the things we need to do to resource ourselves.
So talk about some of the methods. So in the book, you talk about journaling and you talk about meditation. So let's talk about some of the processes for us to help get there.
Yeah. So in the book, I use kind of a process of what I call grounding, knowing, loving, connecting, and being. So for me, it all starts in the body. That one of the legacies of a scientific materialist colonial architecture is our disconnection from our somatic experience. And really, all the information that we need for our freedom is in this body. I mean, it's only through this body and heart and mind that we can understand anything. It's just that in this culture, we tend to focus mostly on the mind and the head. So starting with just being able to be embodied and to feel what has been unfelt, to uncover all that patterning and conditioning. Some of it is personal, some of it is intergenerational, epigenetic, and familial and social, but it's embodied. The trauma that we've experienced, the conditioning we have. So I love the word mindfulness in some ways, and in other ways, I feel like it's a perfect example of the problem, that we took this word sati, which really describes this holistic awareness, this embodied awareness, and we put the word mind right at the beginning of it. And we called it mindfulness. So I like the phrase embodied awareness, so that it really encompasses this way of knowing that is more connected to an indigenous way of knowing, that we can feel and sense and know through the body. So we first ground ourselves to start to orient to that. And then we know ourselves through that. And we start to be able to see where we're tight in the body, where we hold tension, where we hold trauma. We start to notice our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, be able to uncover and be okay with that unconscious material as it surfaces, and not think it's a problem, but just recognize that that's part of the conditioning we've inherited. And from there, very closely related to that is love yourself, is being able to allow So it doesn't mean loving our negative traits or faults, but loving ourselves even in the midst of those things that are patterned and conditioned into us. Because it's only from that place of love then that we can connect. And then connecting ourselves really involves being with others, being with nature, really feeling, allowing ourselves to feel the truth of that interconnection, and not have to turn away from it because of our habituated reactions and conditioning. And from there, we can be ourselves and really be in the world to serve in whatever ways we're meant to.
Hmm. You talked to me before about reflection, revision, refinement, uh, and there was a couple of more R's. I have relationality, and so talk about those.
Yeah, I love you. You brought that up actually, Jonathan. So
Oh,
I
I thought my notes were that you did, but okay. So,
you came up with those 3 R's as kind of part of this process. So yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say about that actually. Reflection, revision, refinement. I think you were talking about your writing process actually when you mentioned that.
um, okay, I thought it was yours, but yes, it probably was mine. So, just that there's, um, we don't know everything instantly, and the interesting thing about meditation is that many people think that meditation means just emptying your mind. Um, and in fact, it can also mean concentrate, really focusing on a thought and really reflecting on it deeply and looking at it from multiple angles and really being with an idea. And the deeper we reflect on things, these little revelations come to us, and we see something deeper. And revision. So yes, this is a writing, but definitely a book writing process or any article writing process. But it's also a thinking process where that reflection that tells you something, you revise and then you refine and you keep getting more and more subtle. But subtle doesn't mean you're narrowing in on a point at the same time, because of this absolute and relative reality intersection. It actually lets you see the relationality. And as you refine something, you can actually see how it fits in the whole, how it is dependent and necessarily always part of a whole. So, um, so for example, in the book, you refer to the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air as constituent elements of, so in Eastern philosophy, we know in Chinese medicine and Chinese philosophy, that's what the world is made of. And in many ways, that is what the world is made of. Um, So when you start to discern something as having these interdependent components that have these individual but related qualities, it helps you see them in another way.
Yeah, I'm remembering our conversation now, and that led me to reflect on something I talk about kind of briefly at the end of the book. This crisis I feel of intimacy and imagination,
Right.
and that crisis of intimacy, that we are not fully embodied, that we are not completely in touch with, or sometimes at all in touch with, our sensations, our feelings, and the elements and the truth of all of these. Really, they're just metaphors of ways of experiencing intimately what's always right here. That the truth of both the absolute and relative always being right here. So for me, the practice, meditation and contemplative practices invite that intimacy. And with that, there is this invitation into imagination. And sometimes I think that gets kind of shortchanged in a mindfulness practice that's only kind of aware of moment to moment experience,
Mm.
that doesn't allow for the imaginal, which is what I feel you were kind of describing in that reflection revision process, that uh, we start to be able to discern the difference between patterned thoughts that are just habituating our clinging and our unskillful ways of being, and ideas and inspirations that are actually inviting something new and creative into our imagination, into the space. And that's where creativity is birthed, is from that intimacy and into that imagination. So I think we both confess that we have notebooks on with us on retreat. And, it's not like I'm journaling when I'm on retreat, but I do jot down ideas that come because they're like little gifts. And, I don't need to cling to them, but they sometimes feel like, there's something coming from that space of the unknown, of that absolute.
Right. I actually feel by writing them down, I can let them go because they're written down. If I don't write them down, because I've been told you're not supposed to write them down, but if I don't write them down, they're harder to get out of my mind and go back. But if I write them down, I know they're okay, they're safe somewhere, and I can let them go for the moment. Buddhism is based on the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And we almost never talk about Sangha. So let's talk about Sangha.
Yeah, I call Sangha the third stepsister. And she sort of cleans up and puts out the cushions and chairs and makes sure everything's taken care of, but isn't kind of adored as much as the Buddha Dharma. We call it the Buddha Dharma, not the Buddha Dharma Sangha. And that relationality is really something that I think is vital for those of us who practiced in Asia. There isn't as much an emphasis in many contexts on the individual. You share retreat space, you room with others, the community is there to provide food, and children are around, and there's much more that feeling of the yin relational aspect of the practice and the culture. Whereas here in our individualistic society and, sort of the sole practitioner on their own breaking through, we've sort of dismissed the importance of Sangha. But I believe that Buddhism and the Buddha are not random. There aren't three jewels just to pay attention to two of them. And so what are we missing in that relationality, and how important that is also to our aspirations for social change? That a lot of what we witness, even in being in quarantine, this isolation and this tendency to kind of be singular actors in our unique spaces, and how I know for me, having been a part of multiple communities and having led different organizations and communities, that relational quality is so important to any true change, that it's not possible without being in deep relationship. And we have an epidemic of loneliness. Even before this pandemic, we had a crisis of belonging, really. And that sense of isolation that people feel, that is not helped by the technology, is really something also that our practice can bring us into, if we bring relationality into our practice, which means we might need to shift our, at least in the insight community, in the tradition I'm in, our emphasis on solo silent retreats being the way that we experience freedom, really.
Although in solo silent retreats, if you do it with others, you feel this incredible nonverbal relationality. But that's really interesting. So what would you shift it from the solo silent retreats, which have their role, but what else what would you add?
Well, one of the things I do, I teach a retreat. Didn't happen this year, but this would have been the fourth year. It's called a belonging retreat, and it's half people of color and half white folks by design. And we spend most of the day in silence, practicing kind of formal sitting walking in the morning, and then spending the afternoon together, practicing together out in nature. So we do practices on the land. This is in at Vallecito's Retreat Center in New Mexico. So we do laying down practices and elements practices and things outside together. So rather than go to a retreat center and spend all your time in this beautiful place inside an air-conditioned space, or what usually happens on a retreat center. We actually go out and practice as a community. We take hikes, and for some folks it's their first time hiking, it's their first time being out in wild nature. And we do that every afternoon. And then the evenings we have very curated relational practice. So it's not that just people are talking. We actually invite reflections and engagement that includes dialogue, but and in affinity groups. So the people of color are working together, the white people are working together and sharing about their experiences, their identity, their sense of belonging. We create an altar together and share about what we brought for the altar. And that process, I find, is just so profound, because you still have a lot of time in silence, but it's actually in relationship. And it's not just sort of you on your cushion for 5 days straight.
Mm. And for those in the audience who haven't been to Vallecitos, it almost is another character in the dialogue, because it's powerful. It is new. It is wild. It is even when we're in nature in America, we've dominated it. There are not that many places where we are small and nature is bigger, and
Yes.
that is one of them.
That is one of them. It's my favorite retreat center. Yeah. Encourage people to check it out next year when they reopen, hopefully.
Yes. So we have some questions, and I'm going to also suggest that we only have a couple, so I'm going to recommend we have some more. So the first one is, the person says, I like to relate to the absolute to implicate order of David Bohm. I don't know if you've seen, there's a new film about David Bohm and Krishnamurti. And if I could remember the title, Monique, maybe you can look it up. But it was David Bohm and Krishnamurti. And it's an interesting film about this idea of implicate order. Are you familiar with it, Sebene?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So, so he was trying to figure out, it's a sad story in a way, because he was trying to figure out the next level of quantum mechanics. And because he had once been a member of the Communist Party, he was treated by the quantum mechanics world. They banned him, and basically wrote this fantastic paper in 1950 that actually kind of answered the next step of quantum mechanics. It's only coming out now and really being reflected and appreciated. But in it, he talks about this idea of implicate order, so that there's like not an explicate order, like a really defined mechanistic thing, but there's something much more subtle going on. And he couldn't get quantum mechanics guys to discuss it with him. And so he ended up finding a partnership with Krishnamurti. And you had an interesting quote for me about Krishnamurti. So tell us your Krishnamurti quote.
Yeah, I got it. It's actually a paraphrase through Jane Fonda. I don't know how that happened, but she quoted him as saying, you think you're thinking your thoughts, you're not. You're thinking the culture's thoughts. And to me, that's such a powerful, kind of like what we were talking about before. We're not, it's not our fault, but we are responsible. So we don't have to take our thoughts personally. There's not a single thought in my mind, because there are no words in my mind that I created myself. I didn't invent my language, my way of seeing the world. It's all been conditioned by the society around me. And so to stop taking the bad thoughts so personally, but also to not take anything I perceive to be as brilliant coming from me as mine either. That it really allows us to let go any sense of ownership of what's going on inside us. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really worth thinking about. That's really worth thinking about, because, yeah. So somebody asked, by the way, what's the name of the retreat center in New Mexico? And it is Vallecitos. I can't remember how it's spelled. Do you remember how it's spelled?
Vallecitos.
Right. So another question is, the next Buddha may be, Thich Nhat Hanh said, the next Buddha may be Sangha.
Yes. Yeah, I love that quote. And I don't think I use it in the book, but I do really, it really resonates for me. there's been some conversation recently about the lack of leadership, and we're kind of always searching for the next leader, whether that's a civil rights leader or a political, other kind of political leader. And something I love about the Black Lives Matter movement actually is it's kind of decentralized, like the sangha is the leader. And that's
Right.
challenging, right? 'Cause first of all, we can't put all of our projections onto one person or someone else. We can't sort of externalize our hopes, but we actually all have to take responsibility for that leadership. And to me, that idea of searching for that Buddha, that teacher, that leader that will lead us to the mountaintop or to the way or to freedom, versus this relational, co-created. That's something else that I really love about retreats that are really integrated in that way, where we're practicing together, kind of in movement, embodied, and relationally sharing, is that it's less a guru model. Not that I consider myself or think anyone else considers me a guru, but guru in the sense of like the teacher at the front of the room kind of espousing, although that's what I'm doing right now, maybe through this forum. But normally, really, I get so much too, and I think there's a power in spaces that allow for what is modeled more maybe through popular education and other forms of movement work that really again decentralize that idea of learning and freedom, really.
So this idea of relationality and co-creation is actually also really growing in organizational management, whether it's not-for-profit businesses or for-profit businesses. Is the idea, number one, that we're all in it together, we all have something to contribute in creating the space for the co-emergence of, so if you really think of it, an organization as the field from which, the healthy soil from which things can grow. It's a figure, it's an interesting figure ground shift. The chef Dan Barber wrote a wonderful book called The Third Plate about soil, in which he said what a great farmer does. A bad farmer thinks his job is to grow crops and is always focused on, well, fertilize them and grow the biggest crops. A good farmer thinks his job is to grow soil. And if the soil is healthy, then the crops, as long as you pay attention to the soil, the crops will take care of themselves if the soil is healthy. And that leads to different crop rotations and everything, but it's all designed to focus on the soil. And I view the soil as the common good. And again, I view that we're in a society that overemphasizes the role of the individual. I think what's coming out of Black Lives Matters and the concerns about climate change and concerns about income inequality is a rebalancing back towards the common good. I hope so. There's a question that asks, have you done any intergenerational belonging retreats?
Not specifically, if they mean having youth, although the belonging retreats at Vallecitos tend to be fairly intergenerational because we get a lot of younger folks, in their 20s, 30s are still young to me at this point. And then also some older folks we've had. I think the oldest person we had is in their 80s. So not intentionally, but I have done intergenerational art projects in the past, like intergenerational photography projects and media projects, and that has been really, really powerful. And I think it's an interesting question and idea to consider.
And in your book, you refer to 7 generations. So there's also intergenerational thinking. It's just to expand our sense of appreciation to the past and responsibility to the future.
Yeah, and I do talk about that also in terms of an honoring of ancestors, so an honoring of land, of lineage, and our own ancestry in our work. Yeah.
Somebody asked about how to purchase your book and not do it through Amazon. So, Greenlight Bookstore, which is in Brooklyn, and do you have any other recommendations for how to purchase your book?
I really love Bookshop because it's a great tool. If you don't know it, you can type in a title and your address, and it will tell you it will direct you to purchasing it from your local bookstore, the bookstore that's closest to you, independent bookstore. Yeah. So bookshop.org.
Great. Perfect. And also this person thanks you for the idea of using embodied awareness in place of mindfulness.
Mm.
So now a question about trauma and multi-generational trauma. It is often that hurt people hurt people. So how do you approach working with these folks to help heal their hurt and helping them see where their behavior of hurting others comes from?
Mm. Well, I don't really advocate trying to work on other people's issues unless that's your job. If you're a therapist or, you do other kinds of healing work and are able to really work with trauma skillfully, because trauma is tricky to work with. So my greatest challenge is actually working with my own hurt and how that inevitably results in me hurting others, and continuing to hurt myself, and really meeting that with that practice of grounding, knowing, loving, connecting. And it's just that process over and over again, to really understand what I'm feeling. And I may never know the causes. I just know that there are a multitude of causes and conditions for every reality. And so I don't necessarily need to try and figure it out or even fix it. And that's the magic and another paradox of these teachings, is that the transformation that we're seeking actually comes from allowing what's here, recognizing and allowing what's here. And it doesn't mean perpetuating what's unskillful or what's unhelpful, but it is softening around what's already here to give it space and time to untangle itself, and it generally does. And it sometimes takes a lot of time and tenderness, and sometimes it takes the help of others, therapists or body workers or healers. Nature is immensely helpful with that, and why we do retreats in places where there's less kind of overwhelming stimuli from all the information and data around us and noise, which you can hear in the background of Brooklyn here. And so all of those can be a factor in helping our own hurt or our own healing.
Talk more about the grounding, knowing, loving, connecting.
Yeah, it's for me, it's a real process of over and over again, really being able to feel my body. So I've trained a bit in what's called focusing, which is a technique that was created by Eugene Genlin. I know there are focusing retreats at Garrison. And he coined this term felt sense to really describe this capacity to feel our experience. So again, we tend to be trained in this culture to know in an intellectual way through words and language, but this is really an untangling or
I'm on a seminar.
of hi
Sorry. Sorry.
So a softening of that into really feeling our experience, and that takes practice and time. So beginning to be able to experience an emotion or let's say an upset, and not just start to spin in stories about it, to actually drop into the body, feel what's happening, and maybe begin to give just a few handles, like a word or an image to that, to help us kind of connect to it more deeply, but to really start to be able to feel our experience. And from there, then we start to know and love, allow it. And, these aren't necessarily distinct steps that we do broken up, but really a process that sort of feeds into, they each feed into the other. So that's been a technique and a process that was really supported me in helping my quote unquote mindfulness practice be more embodied, more felt, more sensed.
A question that relates to your being an immigrant. Any advice for immigrants that feel like they belong nowhere? I feel like a foreigner in a new country, like I no longer belong in the original country, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I feel you. Mention in the book, and I do believe that I wrote a book about belonging because I didn't feel like I belonged for most of my life. And of course, the truth is that the title, you belong, we all belong. There is that truth of interconnection, and part of healing that sense. That false feeling of not belonging is beginning to know what uh, what that not belonging feels like, and we might begin to uncover why. So for me, experiencing a lot of anti-Black racism and feelings of difference that were quite intense, even when there wasn't aggression attached to it. It can be just aggressive to not see yourself reflected in media and culture, to not be the ideal of beauty or intelligence or culture or whatever it is. So you might be able to start to untangle that. That those feelings of not belonging and not feeling that sense of connection are because you aren't reflected around you, and maybe you need to change your environment so that you do feel that connection, that you have places to process that feeling of disconnection. For me, um, being and practicing in communities of color, so POC, people of color, sanghas, and meditation retreats and groups has been really powerful to have conversations that I can't really have in white sanghas, and not because the conversation is not welcome, but I'm not going to get sort of the depth of understanding and reflection that I do from my POC peers. So that might be a place to start, to really allow that that's the reality that you experience, and to start to heal from that through spaces or places that can help you experience what's going on in a more full way.
Mhm. So a last question. This forum series is called Pathways to Planetary Health.
Mm.
So how does belonging tie into planetary health?
Yeah, I'm so interested in this question, Jonathan. I don't go into it much in the book, but it really is so key to a lot of the work I'm doing. I lead a sangha at New York Insight called Sacred Earth Sangha that really is exploring this question of the truth of our interconnection and how we bring the the power of a social justice lens into our work of planetary health, so that no one is kind of left out of the conversation, that we reclaim perspectives that have been lost or suppressed, like indigenous ways of knowing, that climate justice is tied to racial justice and social justice. Environmental justice is not disconnected from um, the truths of our reality of colonization and industrialization, white supremacy and patriarchy, and all that they have ensued. Um, so I feel like that's a huge, huge exploration and conversation, but it's so central to belonging because we only have one planet, and the truth of this delusion of separation, which is at the heart of our crisis, is ultimately a separation from nature, and we can't harm what we feel is sacred and that we feel fully connected to. And so that healing of our um, sense of not belonging, I think, is fundamental to the healing of our planet.
Perfect. And thank you. Uh, Thank you for your beauty, intelligence, and culture that you have brought to this conversation. And it's been fantastic spending this hour with you. And I know those who joined you in the virtual Sangha feel the same. These sessions are offered free of charge, but we'd love it if you'd support our programming by making a donation, which you should be able to do through our website. Please keep checking garrisoninstitute.org for updated listings of future sessions and to view recordings of this conversation, which we'd love for you to share with your friends and colleagues, and recordings of the other ones we've had too. Our next conversation in the Pathways to Planetary Health Forum is on Thursday, August 27th, and it features the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, Gideon Rose, who also happens to be my cousin. So with that, we'll thank you and all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.